Welcome to Oxford University Press. I'm here today with Richard Chinn and Danny Norrington-Davies, and we are going to be having a conversation about working with emergent language. It would be great if you took part in the conversation virtually by giving us the questions that you'd like Danny and Richard to answer about this topic, and we will, I think, learn a lot and find out a lot about what emergent language is and what it means for teachers. But before we get into that, I'd like to give Danny and Richard a chance to introduce themselves, to say a little bit about who you are and what you do.
So my name's Danny Norrington-Davies. I'm a teacher and teacher trainer at International House, London. I work on CELTA courses, Delta courses, various courses for teachers, and a lot of teaching. I teach general English classes mainly. Yeah.
Thank you, Danny. Richard?
So I'm Richard Chinn. I'm a teacher educator as well. I've been in English language teaching for over 20 years now. I've been a teacher trainer for a long time. I mainly work at the moment on the MAT Sol at King's College London, where I coordinate the CELTA programme with International House, where I've been based for the last 15 years.
And you both have an interest in emergent language, which is the topic of our discussion today. Shall we take a look at what that is and perhaps a definition of sorts?
So I suppose just to contextualise this, when we learn language, in any language, there's so many different ways to learn language, there's not just one way. But we often encounter things that are unfamiliar. And that's what we mean by emergent language. When it's not planned language, it's unplanned language that's needed or produced by learners in the classroom, this is. When learners are trying to communicate meaning in these meaning-focused interactions, the language that comes up is then looked at through clarification, the teacher exploring that language with the learners, and reformulating it if necessary, and giving support to that language that comes up. So it's the kind of thing that happens all the time when we're learning a language, but in the classroom specifically, we mean this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's these little moments where a student says something, like in my class the other day, a student said, I don't working at the moment. And you sort of say, oh, what do you mean? You're not working now? And they say, yes, I'm not working now. Just a little moment where what they say, you think, okay, I'm not quite sure what you mean, or I think you could be a little bit clearer here. You just take that little moment to work with what they give you.
And the key thing is with that, it becomes an opportunity for learning. Yeah. So that's what we mean by emergent language. Those, exploiting those opportunities where language can be learnt, so that something that the learner needs at that moment for their development.
Yeah.
Great. If you have a question about working with emergent language that you'd like Richard and Danny to answer, you know what to do. Put it in the Q&A tab, and we will try to get to as many of these questions as we can during the course of this conversation. Okay, so you mentioned that it's unplanned language, but could you say a bit more about what kind of language emergent language can be? So, for example, I'm thinking straight away of vocabulary that might come up.
It's commonly vocab. I find if I sort of look at my boards at the end of I tend to take photos of my boards every day. It's quite rich in vocabulary and collocation. But of course it can be grammar, and of course it could be pronunciation. You've been working a lot with discourse.
Yeah, as well, and we can come on to that in a bit, but I think back to your original point, it is often words that we're missing. We don't have a concrete noun for something, or we don't have the right grammar to express an idea, or we don't know how to pronounce something. So they're the things that we generally work with. An example of that would be one that we noted down at the beginning of a lesson. I was watching this lesson. It was a Delta lesson, so quite experienced teacher, and she was welcoming the students into the lesson, and she said, to the class, what did you do this morning? And one of the students, a quite low-level learner, so they're all pre-intermediate, he said, I watered and he didn't know the concrete noun that comes next. This went on for a little while, and the other students were trying to help guess what he meant, and he was very frustrated because he wanted to communicate this specific thing. And she said, do you mean this? And she went to Googled it on the whiteboard, and it came up, and it was a window box. Now, you would never teach that word, and for good reason, because it's very low frequency, but in that moment, the student wanted that specific piece of vocabulary. So that would be an example of where we might teach something that we wouldn't ordinarily find in course materials, but the student wanted in that moment.
And just lately, the thing I've sort of been concentrating on, because it's going to be sort of series of talks, I think, is the language of kind of mediation. Because I've been working with students at sort of intermediate plus and noticing that they often don't do things like say, oh, do you see what I mean? Or, sorry, I don't know what you mean. And actually trying to work with the language there that will smooth the interaction between them. So it really is everything.
Okay. There's a question from Peter John who says, is emergent language the same as interlanguage?
Interlanguage, in terms of the journey that you go on when you're learning, no, it's not really. I mean, that's an older idea of how language acquisition happens. So emergent language simply means it's the language we didn't plan to teach, but we teach, and that's what we're defining it as here. But it's certainly, if you take that view of acquisition, that older view of acquisition, language that comes up in the learner's interlanguage is what you deal with at their stage of development that they're ready for.
Sure.
It's a sort of internal syllabus,
Yeah.
I suppose, a little thing that the student needs at that exact moment.
Well, one thing that might be useful for everyone following the conversation is if we have a little example of a situation that a teacher might have in a class, for example, doing a lesson from a course book where there's an image. And I think it's a very common experience for any teacher that working with an image can be something which leads to emergent language needs or questions. So hopefully something we will be able to show you in just a moment is a photograph. And it would be a pleasure if you guys were able to kind of put yourselves in the teacher's position and tell us a bit about what emergent language needs might arise from a class in which this image is being used.
Well, this is a lesson I do because I have classes very often for a month, and then you move to another class. I've used this lesson quite a lot, and it's about a festival in Belgium called the Doudou Festival, and it's just asking the students, what do you think is happening in the picture, which is such a, for me, an everyday question. And it's really everything the students say in this moment is really emergent language, because it's not my target language. It's not what I'm planning to teach. So if a student says, I think it's, I get a lot of Spanish students will say, maybe it's a manifestación, and I know what that means because I speak Spanish, but I might say, what do you mean? Because I know I'm in multilingual classes. So I'll have to
for the
deal with
benefit
that.
of people who don't speak
A
Spanish.
demonstration.
Right.
If it's a student who doesn't know their word, they might say it's all, oh, no to this, no, holding signs, teacher. And you're like, oh, you mean a demonstration. So their guesses are very often examples of emergent language. So they might say they are football fans, but fighting.
Right.
You know, you mean football hooligans.
We have a little example from your board, Danny, of how you capture some of the language which emerges.
So this is a lower level group, because I use this with quite a few levels. I often have my sort of standalone lessons that I like to use. So you've got the hooligans example here. Some people know the word fans, but some don't know the word hooligans. In this lesson, we ended up talking about concert and gig, because I think they were saying it must be rock or heavy metal, but it's not classical music. And so I was saying it's more likely to be a gig. Things like carnival, that's just their idea. You know, maybe it's a kind of carnival, or a national day. So everything here is an example of emergent language. Some of it's been reformulated and explored. Some of it, you're giving them language that they just didn't know. I think with rave and carnival and national day, that's just what they're suggesting.
Right.
So that's language they have already.
We have an interesting observation from Sihami, who said, I often did dogma in classroom situations to deal with emergent language. My learners often bring language or terms or new words which need immediate help, but sometimes I didn't have all the answers. Any tips for these cases? Because learners expect immediate answers these days.
I'm okay with saying, I don't know. I'll get back to you. And I think if you do say that, you must, because otherwise I think they'll lose trust. And so I think you've got to create a culture of saying to students, I'll get back to you on that. I had recently reject and refuse. What's the difference between reject and refuse?
Not easy to answer.
And actually I realised, well, 30 years of teaching, no one's actually asked me that question before. And it was kind of, oh my gosh, so I started writing it on the board. The second I did, I realised that refuse to was the solution to that problem. So reject, and I think I said reject an application, reject a candidate, and I was kind of guessing what the best collocations were. But the second I realised that to was going, refuse to do it, refuse to come.
It's a very encouraging message for all teachers that even after 30 years, it's actually inevitable and okay not to have all the answers there.
I think something to add, though, we're in an age where we do, a lot of people have access to technology, whether that's Googling something, and actually, I think you're right, Danny, about being honest. It comes with a bit of confidence, being honest that, I'm not quite sure, but let's have a look together, for example. And a colleague of ours recently has been exploring using AI to do this, where the AI actually gives you, it can give you grammatical information, it can give you semantic information, it can give you pragmatic information. So I think, we do have that resource in class. But it might be a case, as Danny says, the old-fashioned ways to say, well, I'm not quite sure right now, let me make a note of it and we'll come back to it after the break or tomorrow.
I encourage higher level, I tell higher level students to be cautious with things like ChatGPT and just say, you're going to be using a lot of energy asking this question, but say to them, ask the AI, what are the 3 most common collocations with reject? And I guessed an applicant would come quite high and proposal would come in that top 3, and it did. But sometimes you go, oh, that's high up, that's interesting. Another example was a student asked, can you say, I spectated? And I said, I don't think so. And then they said, yes, but when you're gaming, you have the option to spectate.
Oh, interesting.
And I said, well, I don't
know that.
So I had no idea because I'm not of that world.
Let's stay with the example of being in the classroom with an image and a board and language captured on that board. And we actually have another image taken from your whiteboard, Danny.
So this was a higher level group. And I'm not really going off lesson with all this because my plan is, some people can probably guess, it's can't be, could be, might be, it is, it isn't type distinction. So I've sort of planned my board in terms of the certainty of your prediction. But you can see that other things are coming up. So, I'm pretty sure it's here. I don't know why, but I just think it is. This is that typical moment where a student just says, well, I don't know why I think that. That's just my prediction.
And there's a gap there.
And there's a gap there. So I give them the phrase they can use to do that. But I've also got, obviously, my board works okay. I've got things like, this has come up, tradition and traditionally, and that's the only bit of space I've got left to deal with it. And here is the vocab from the first bit of the lesson, the prediction. And obviously the students have shown some interest in the difference between a protest and demonstrate.
I think what's interesting here, though, you've taken those single words and you've looked at the company that those words are keeping, so you're giving the learners more to say. And it's kind of systems building in terms of building up their knowledge of language, because you're looking at what's possible, sort of paradigmatically coming down, different options that you can have, but also in terms of syntax, what's possible, protest against what other options do I have? And I really like the way that you've done that.
This language here has come from the students, and I suspect they've been doing IELTS.
An important thing to remind people of is that your definition of emergent language was language that the students want or need. So this isn't the case of the teacher just being in the mood to give a long presentation.
No, and I think that's really important, that if you go in with ideas of what you want to teach, actually that is target language. That's what you've decided. Even maybe on a sort of slightly subconscious level, you might have target language in your head, and it's actually thinking about what the learners need, and that will vary from context to context. So for example, if you're in a business English context, then the language that you are going to work with in the lesson, in interaction, is going to be filtered through that particular need, of business English in that context, or an IELTS class. So I think that is important to consider that. Emergent language works on a kind of continuum from the teacher initiating it or the learner initiating it. And very often we find it's the teacher, because the teacher can spot where the learners need help. We jump in, we notice there's something, we might reformulate it, we might scaffold what the learner wants to do, so we give them autonomy over a piece of language so that they can gain control over it. Or it might be the learner asking the question, but I think we do need to consider at the very extreme end, is the teacher deciding on the language, or actually are we looking at what's possible and are we exploring that language? And there's a fine line, I think, between the teacher making that decision, or actually is it something that's needed by the learners?
Well, interestingly, I have a question for you, Danny, because this was a concrete example of a lesson that you actually taught. We've had a really interesting question from Sharda, who said, how long would you spend clarifying unplanned language, and how would you cover the language that you did plan to teach? So Danny, I wonder, can you remember how you planned this particular lesson in terms of how much time you had?
I think I'm in quite a privileged position at International House London, because I have a 3-hour class or a 2-hour class. So it doesn't matter terribly if I'd spend half an hour on the lead-in, or if we end up dealing with protest, demonstrate, demand and march. I'm lucky. I know some people can't, but I think I am still focused on the target language, and the could be, might be. It's possibly in the course book kind of syllabus that we're following. But my view is that they're going to remember that target language better if it's tacked on to the phrases and the language they wanted to use at the same time. So I'm not really deviating massively from a plan. I'm just taking my time to put the learners' voices into the language. If I'm going to cut something, it might be the controlled practice where they're filling in gaps or making sentences that are true for them. They've already made those. So I'm actually killing two birds with one stone in that situation.
Interesting.
Can I ask a question with that? And so after that, I'm guessing, what happened to that language then? Did they, so they didn't do a gap fill or whatever else? What did you do with it?
Another picture.
Yeah,
I've got this picture of, it's a Brixton station, an underground station in London, and I'm presuming it's come from an advert or something. There's a sort of traditional bride standing outside the station with her arms folded, looking angry. And what do you think has happened?
And then they use that language in order to...
Yeah, she could be waiting for her husband and all this sort of stuff. And they're really creative. They end up all just saying, I think.
We are talking to Danny Norrington-Davies and Richard Chinn about Emergent Language. This panel is coming to you live from Oxford University Press. We'd love to hear your voice and your questions as well. Thank you to everyone who's been typing their questions into the chat box. We have talked about what Emergent Language is. We've talked about the kinds of examples of language that might come up that students need or want to learn in an unplanned context of a lesson. And it all seems to require the teacher being very skilled and comfortable with this. There may be some challenges that teachers feel. So there's a question from Such P in the chat, which is, what would be a reason behind a teacher avoiding working on emergent language during a class? And I guess a sense of it being overwhelmingly difficult or challenging to do that. I wonder, can you tell us something about how teachers can, what some of the challenges are?
Yeah, I think, there is a perception that it's difficult, and I think that's for us as well when we first started working with it, because you've got to think in the moment, teaching in general requires a lot of multitasking. It's a lot of attention that our brains are having to deal, having stretched basically. You're having to listen to the learners. You've got to think about what you're going to do next. You've got to listen to what the learners have said, the actual language they've used. You've got to come up with a reformulation, a reason for that. So there's a lot going on at any one time. So it is difficult to be able to do those things. That's probably the main difficulty. Other things that come up might be, that you have a very strict syllabus or course, can only stick to the course book, and finding space for it might be tricky. We can chat about that a little bit later. But they're kind of the two things. And I think people, often teachers don't have confidence in working with it. And certainly that's the biggest complaint. And, we have the privilege of watching teachers teach a lot. And you notice where people miss these opportunities. Also, teachers might not feel that they they're allowed to work with emergent language. You know, they might not see the value in it. I remember one teacher I was working with when I was doing my master's research on this, and she thought, well, it's just an aside, it's just something we just do very quickly, and I might not even put it on the board, I might write a single word on the board, but I move past it because I've got to get onto my main aim. You know, the main aim's important, but there's an opportunity to teach something that might be memorable and durable for the learners there and then because they want to say something, or there's a gap in their knowledge, in their internal syllabus. So I think it is looking for those opportunities where we can work with that for teachers. So raising awareness of the value of working with emergent language and looking at some of the reasons, you know, we learn through interaction, you know, different perspectives on how we learn language, but interaction is important. So, you know, maybe making teachers aware of some of those sort of deeper principles about why it's important to work with emergent language. And, you know, giving learners a voice, as Danny mentioned before, you know, it's about learner agency. We really see emergent language as providing choices rather than, you know, necessarily saying that's right, that's wrong. Maybe giving learners alternatives and options that they can use with language as well.
I think it's important to see it as, like with dogma, is people rejected dogma because it was not something they could do, but you can have a dogma moment.
This is the approach that's sometimes called teaching unplugged.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, but you can have emergent language moments, just it's those little seconds during a lesson when you just help the student with what they want to say. So you know, some people think it's this big, completely different way of teaching. And actually it's not, it's those little moments. And so I was watching a teacher the other day, very, very new teacher, teaching their second lesson on a CELTA, and just as they were monitoring, two students were talking, and one was sort of trying to say that they couldn't do something because they'd had a toothache. And she said, "Oh, you mean you had a toothache?" And they, "Oh, yes, teacher, I had a toothache." And then she moved on into a different part of the lesson, you know, different, to monitor another group. Little emergent language moment, not affecting the plan in any way, but just helping the student.
And then there are other times, I think, you know, where emergent language pops up when you least expect it as well. For example, I was watching a CELTA lesson, and it was a new teacher. He hadn't really taught before, and a group of pre-intermediate students who knew each other quite well, and they were very chatty. And one of the students was a French guy, and he was saying, we were talking about cities, and you know what it's like in different cities. And the Gare du Nord, which is the station where the Eurostar arrives in Paris, he said the Gare du Nord, there are lots of scammers. And the other students didn't know the word scammer, so suddenly we had what? The teacher wanted to move on because he'd understood it, but then suddenly the students hadn't understood it. So what they did was to push the teacher to clarify it. The student tried; he didn't have enough language to do it. So the teacher was then pushed to explain what a scammer was, put it on the board, and to deal with that. So the language can come from the learners, and it might not just be, you know. And we deal with these things very regularly in class, and we might not notice that we're doing it. And I think we, as teachers, we don't value actually the skill that we develop in responding to learners. And I think for me, you know, I've learned a lot from looking at this to actually really value what I do as a teacher, and what, you know, there's some of the kind of things that are missed by us as teachers that are actually really valuable learning strategies that we use in class.
Richard, you've aligned very neatly with a question from James P. I'd love to hear your response to it. James says, is it sometimes tricky to manage emergent language in the classroom without the teacher simply giving new vocabulary to students? Surely minimizing teacher talk and using discovery methods are preferable.
Yeah, but I mean, the problem is, I remember, okay, I'll start. I think we're probably going to go the same way with this one. Yeah. I remember watching a teacher teach once on a Delta course where he didn't teach them anything. It was just basically discovering. It was the most frustrating hour that I'd spent for me and the students, because this teacher's belief was that everything had to be discovery. Well, actually, you know, a quicker way of doing it might be it's this, or it might be translation. It depends on the context that you're in, but certainly being explicit about the language that you're focused on. It's not about teacher talk. Actually, you know, there's unhelpful teacher talk. You know, we you know, on CELTA courses you always hear too much teacher talking time. It's problematic, that, because actually the teacher does do a lot of talking, but it depends what, you know, the quality of the teacher talk that's happening. So if you're working with the learners and you're reformulating what they're saying, you're supporting what they're saying, that's actually useful teacher talk, you know, because that involves scaffolding, that involves working with the learner language and working sort of psychologically with what they need. Do you want to add to that?
I've come to dislike the phrase quite a lot. Sorry, James P. For some students, we know that input is absolutely necessary for language to occur, and sometimes the best source of input that learners can get is the teacher, and yet they're trying to limit how much they speak. It's
the more authentic source of language in a sense, or genuine source, because you're interacting, which is often what we do with language. And I think that's valuing that role of you as a teacher in supporting that is really important.
If we go back to the board and the student said it's football fans but they're fighting, I can't help them discover the word hooligan. That's going to take a lot of teacher talk.
Yes.
But you could certainly ask the question.
Oh, you mean a hooligan?
Yeah.
You could ask the question. So, what do you mean? Does anyone know the word for that? No. Okay, and you might elicit to check. If they don't know, don't turn it into a guessing game, because they don't know it.
They don't know.
But we've opened up space there where we can actually go, right, what is that? And we can draw attention to it and explore it.
Yeah. And you're helping learners with what they need. Yeah. So for me, that's good teacher talk.
It just makes students guess. I think it's frustrating.
Feel free, of course, to use the chat to tell us how you work with emergent language, how you make the kinds of decisions that Danny and Richard are talking about. It's an interesting opportunity for you to read each other's ideas and stances on this, in addition to hearing what Richard and Danny have to say about this. We are here in Oxford. It's live. We're talking about emergent language with Richard Chinn and Danny Norrington-Davies. And we have lots of interesting topics. And one thing that I've seen coming up quite a bit in the chat box is this tension between wanting to work with emergent language, wanting to make the lesson interesting and authentic, but the knowledge that as a teacher you have a very strict pacing schedule, you have certain units you have to finish by certain times, and you may feel that you don't have enough time to work with emergent language. What is your advice to teachers who find themselves in that position?
I think firstly, if you do have a strict syllabus, and especially if you have tests at the end of units, for example, then that's what you are that's the contract between you and the students. You've got to do what you're there to do. But it's just about taking little moments in lessons. So for example, reading is probably part of the syllabus, or listening is part of the syllabus. But taking a moment where you ask a question like, what would you do in this situation? They've read the text, they've understood it, they've practiced the comprehension questions. Throw in a more open question and you get a little 1 minute of working with emergent language. But you probably have speaking tasks as well. So it's that at the end of the speaking activity, it's maybe noting down some useful emergent language and doing what some people call a delayed feedback or delayed correction slot, where you'll write some things on the board and work with it. Those are fairly normal parts of a lesson. But also remembering you can do a lot of emergent language work while you're monitoring students doing tasks. So what you're noticing students saying together or what they're putting down on paper. So you just take the little opportunities you have without radically altering your plan.
And I think, sorry, just to add to that, it's at the planning stage you need to consider it. So when you're planning your lesson, you're looking at your material. As Danny said, it's looking for, is it the lead-in where you're going to have that little bit of moment? When a learner's going to be, back to our definition, engaging in meaningful interaction. And as soon as they are, there are going to be opportunities to work with emergent language, and it's building that into your lesson and thinking, where is that feedback stage? Because if your goal is to get them communicating, then there will be opportunities to work with that language, and it's factoring it in. I think on top of that as well, it's not just the lesson plan, but valuing when that language emerges, that it becomes part of your syllabus. Not all of it, maybe. A lot of things might go up on the board. You need to be selective about it. Maybe as a group you discuss which language is most useful towards the exam or the topics that you're going to be looking at. But that becomes part of your syllabus. It's a bit like a snowball. You pick up that language as you move forward, because no course can never be the same, because the people are different, the needs are different. So in that way, you're moving towards making a more unique course for the group of students that you're working with, by just allowing that space for that emergent language to become part of the course that you're teaching and to personalise it to those learners' needs.
Well, if Ludmilla T was here, I know exactly what she'd say, Richard. She'd say sometimes it's difficult to balance key vocabulary and emergent language revision. And without revision, it's lost. But altogether, it becomes overwhelming, and we need studying and revision of a lot of other things as well. Any tips for organising revision? This links so nicely to what you were saying about the snowball effect.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm working in class, I haven't been in the class for a couple of years now as I'm working at the university, but one of the things I religiously did was to make lexical cards, really. It was often Lexis, or cards with a little bit of discourse that might be an adjacency pair, for example, and I'd make a practice activity on the back so that, at the beginning of a class the next day, or waiting for some of the others to arrive, we might do a little bit of revision with that, but certainly at some point in each week we do something with that language to revise it. I think now there's lots of possibilities. Again, you've got to be careful with energy use, but you can very quickly put all your emergent language into AI and get it to make a worksheet for you. I think we've said before that emergent language, today's emergent language becomes tomorrow's target language as it becomes part of your syllabus. So I think it's valuing that it's become part of it. And then why not have the target language that was taught and the emergent language that's come up? Why not have it put into a text with gaps in it, for example, or to some sort of practice activity? It could be an old-fashioned gap fill. It could be some sort of relay race that you're doing, but some sort of way of revising that language and letting it be part of that organic process of your course developing. Yeah,
I'm exactly the same. I will always have cut-up cards in my room.
And it's no coincidence, I think, that we have photos that you've taken of your boards. Is that part of the way you look to capture and revise?
I always take photos of my board, and I kind of I want my students to take photos of the board, but I want them to actually do something with them.
Yeah.
So I will tell them as they're taking the photos, how are you going to remember that vocabulary? And they'll go, they don't know. So I'll say, Friday, we're going to have a quick game. How many words can you remember? And what I'll sometimes do is I'll use the shape button I'll take a photo and use the shape button on, I think it's Word, and I'll put shapes over the words.
Right.
And including, so if I had the could be, I'd have could, might, can't, definitely done, because that's the target language. That's probably what's coming up in the test. But I've maybe covered hooligan and gig and demonstration. So there's that little 5-minute game, and that can be played in the 5 minutes when you've taught too fast.
There's one thing I like to do, which is a similar thing, but when you've got the language on the board, I think you're right, students take a photo of it. I do it all the time when I go to talks and things. I take a photo of it and I never look at it again. But I often get them to have a look at the language that's on there and select, let's say, 10 to 20 items have gone up through the lesson. I might say, choose 5 that you think are going to be really useful to you. And the learners go home and practice those. They can create sentences. And then the next day, get them back in class. And the first thing that we do is test your partner. Okay, can you remember these bits of language? So that language is recycled in that way. But there's a kind of, a learner training that's happening as well, because you're encouraging the learners to be good learners. Because that's what you need to do when you're learning language outside the classroom anyway, as well.
You're both teacher trainers who work a lot with developing teachers and new teachers. So I'm sure that you've had many conversations about managing the class and the kinds of classroom management decisions that a teacher needs to make to feel that they're in control, or letting the students have control. Could you say a bit about what a teacher could do if they are worried that if they start opening the door to emergent language, that they might lose control of the class?
I think I don't see it happening. That's the interesting thing. And I work with, because I teach on CELTA, I work with a lot of people who have no teaching experience at all. And actually, it's about having little moments where things happen. They tend to be quite momentary. Interestingly, so Luke Meddings and Scott Thornbury recently released, I think it was called Dogma in Practice, and some of the International House London teachers shared their experiences, and one of them, she said her big learning from taking the opportunity to have Dogma moments were that they were just moments. And she said, because she wanted it to become this sort of big event, and that she'd capture some big learning moment. It was something about air fryers. And she realised, actually, it's just a 2 minutes where she didn't lose control because she just helped them with what they needed, and they're kind of satisfying. I think sometimes when you're following your plan quite religiously, you're more in danger of losing control because people want to say something, or the bit that piques their interest in a text has been brushed past. And actually, so they're kind of still reading the text, or they're going, what does that mean? That's where control is often lost.
It's those moments, as you say. It's not always, but there's moments where everybody's attention is focused on wanting to know why, because it suddenly becomes very meaningful, that piece of language that's come up. Oh, when can I use that? When can't I use that? For example, and I think that's interesting. The other thing is, putting people in groups. So, throwing it back to the learners, listening to the learners. It doesn't have to, all be open class, because that can be quite face-threatening, certainly if you're not feeling very confident to work in the moment and to respond and do all that multitasking that I mentioned before. So, actually getting learners to work in groups, as Danny said, and then listening, going around monitoring what they're saying, and spending a couple of moments with different students, because it might be hard to hear the whole group when they're talking. I certainly find that very difficult. Now I'm not in the class enough, and I've got quite big classes that I teach at the moment. I find it really hard to monitor and hear what they're saying. So, really stopping with the group for a moment and tuning into what they're saying, noting down what they're saying, what's meaningful about what they're saying, and then taking a moment out while everybody's busy to think about what you want to do in feedback, and you can have a bit more control over the lesson in that way.
Yeah, I think showing your students that you are listening to them, that you're interested in what they say, that you will help them with the needs that emerge during the lesson is going to keep them motivated, keep them engaged. It's kind of going to make them respect you more because they know you're there for them.
That's a great point.
The other thing is about monitoring. A teacher in Senegal, I think it was a teacher in Senegal, and they have classes of 70. The best phrase they ever used is, they said, when I'm monitoring this group of 5, I've got to turn off the eyes in the back of my head. It's a brilliant phrase. And she said, I'm helping these 5. If that 5, she always talked about having groups of 5. And she said, if there's a group talking about the football in Wolof, then that's on them. I'm helping these guys.
We have an interesting question in the chat box from Ali Reza. And Ali Reza says, interestingly, what does the literature say about emergent language? So I'm delighted to say, Ali Reza, the literature is here because Danny and Richard are the authors of an excellent book on working with emergent language. And Ali Reza's question is, does any uptake really occur in the process of working with emergent language?
I think it really depends how you define uptake, because there are different ways of looking at it. Is it that the students write something down in their notebook? Do they nod their head? Do they actually use it? It depends on how you're looking at uptake. The way that we've used it is that the learners can note in some way that they're recognising that language is there. It happens all the time, and we call them notebook moments, or a colleague of ours, Melissa Lamb, did. It's that moment where you put something goes up on the board, or you say, this is what goes up on the board, and suddenly everybody in the room goes, because at that moment it was something interesting, different, useful. So that kind of uptake you get. Also, you notice, there's the lovely uptake moment. So, like, later on in the lesson where the learner then uses, or in that moment as the learner's playing with the language, you might have scaffolded it with the learner saying it, and it helped everybody be able to say it, and then the learner throws it back to you. So you do get that kind of, it could be quite echoic, or it could be more delayed. It's difficult to say it's learned, but certainly you do see uptake. Is there anything you want to add to?
But I think you're putting all those other things about meeting the language again, recycling the language, having the sort of spaced repetition between the meeting it again.
Recall,
yeah. But I think there is some research saying that language given at the point of need is more likely to stick, because it's kind of the student's primed for it. It's, I don't know this, and so now I need it. And if the teacher provides that language, they're more likely to take it on board. Whereas if you're teaching a large class and you are presenting a tense, for example, you've probably got students sitting there going, I know this. Some students going, okay, this is helping. But there are some students going, what tense is this? I don't understand. So, when you're kind of teaching to a syllabus, you're probably hitting the middle of the room. So I think.
And to add to that, we'd say, and this is based on the literature, whether you look at it from a sort of cognitivist perspective or a sociocultural perspective, actually, an explicit focus on the language is necessary. And it kind of makes sense if you think you've only got your language learners for a short amount of time very often. It's not like when you're learning your first language, or second or third language, but learning it through immersion. It's kind of difficult for most language learners internationally to do that. So an explicit focus on the language can help accelerate that kind of learning.
Danny, you mentioned a large class situation earlier. I think many people listening to us today do teach large classes and are thinking about how this would work in their context. For example, Fatima says, how can we deal with wide classes of 45 students, brackets, that don't listen or show any respect?
I think I'd say the same answer. I think if they're not showing respect, obviously you've got to wonder why not.
Yeah.
But for me, it would be then showing that you're listening and you're interested in what they're saying and you're giving them opportunities to talk about what they want to talk about. I think they're more likely to sort of gain a respect for the process or an understanding of the process, because they might be sort of sitting there thinking, well, why am I studying this language? What does this language mean to me? What am I going to do with it? You want being able to say what you want to say is what language learners want to do. So I think taking those moments are quite important. Again, going back to teachers in Senegal, they said very often it wasn't lack of respect for the teacher that bothered the teachers, it was lack of respect for one another. And so what they had to do in the large class, and very often teams as well, is about dealing with things as you monitor and not dealing with things open class, because the second you started correcting students on the spot in front of an open class situation, others would laugh and go, you can't say that word. So it's about the groups. And so they had great strategies, and the teacher was called Mariam Sarr. Her name's just always stayed with me because she was such an interesting teacher. She got these groups of 5 from classes of 70 who always worked together. And she said they formed these quite respectful groups. So you deal with the groups one-on-one most of the time. Occasionally you'd nominate a spokesperson to share. And it would be the confident student. But that's okay because they've done their work together. So I think for me it comes down to showing that you listen and are interested.
Do you have anything to add, Richard?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, because it's often asked, and it might not be appropriate. You might not have the space to do it in a large class, in some very large classes. But our colleague Vicky, who we interviewed a few years ago now, who works in Argentina, and she worked with high school kids. And so what she would do is, again, put them in groups she found worked very well. Doing whole class feedback didn't work as well, but working with Emergent Language by going around and monitoring different groups, and she had sort of biggish classes of 30 plus, I think. That seemed to work in that particular context.
This feels like a good moment to talk about L1 and L2. And we've had some questions in the chat about use of L1. So Milka has said, what's your opinion of the use of L1 in a beginner adult learning class with many being literacy learners? And I think you could also tell us a little bit about whether a teacher who shares the same L1 as their learners is in an advantageous position or not to work with emergent language.
Well, I know we're both very strong, feel about this very strongly. The L, let's take for example the L1. It could be the L2 or a shared language. It's the greatest resource that you have. So it would be very bizarre not to exploit that and use it. And if we take kind of ideas that we use all of our language resources in order to communicate, this idea of translanguaging, then that's really got to be implicit in our teaching. And I think there are very good reasons why we might just want the students to speak mostly in, let's say English in class, because that might be the only opportunity they get to do it. But you've got a very low level class. I mean, the easiest thing to do is you have it, and then we have these kind of meta-linguistic discussions about the language and how you can use it, when you can use it. That's all very useful in the language learning process. So that's, certainly my opinion on that. And you want to add to that, Danny?
I mean, I think if you think of the phrase, how do I say in English, if you weren't going to use the
thing you need, isn't
L1,
it?
that phrase would never be used in the classroom. So I think it's this hugely important resource. It cannot be ignored. I worked with teachers in Turkey, and what they did, they started off saying it was kind of, we can't do it, we mustn't do it. But I noticed they were doing it all the time. And so I said, you told me you're not allowed to, but you're doing it all the time. And they said, yeah, because it's simple and effective. And it's like, then yes, keep doing it. And the only advice I said is that phrase, how do I say in English? I said, make them use that phrase in English. But also I think the other thing they would do is they would listen to the question in Turkish as they monitored and then say, now ask me in English. They'd give them the answer and they'd say, now ask me again in English. And the students were quite happy to do that because they wanted an answer to a question that they could only, they wanted it quickly, so they asked in Turkish. And the teacher took little teaching moments from that to give them the word and then say, I know you know that phrase, ask me in English. And again, the students felt listened to, I think.
And if the students have the freedom to ask that question, that's so rich for emergent language because it's going to open up the possibilities to how do I say, I mean, the difficulty is then the student asks you something very complicated, let's say, third conditional or something, and then you'll think, how do I simplify what the learner wants to say? That might be something that the teacher's got to mediate. But that happens quite a lot, and you might think, what's a simple way of doing that? Or teach it lexically rather than teaching it grammatically, for example.
I think going back to that point about respect that we had on in the chat, is if you are marginalising a student's language, you're marginalising their identity and the community that they have together, to tell them they're not allowed to use it is incredibly problematic.
And it comes from this tradition of 100 years of English only, or the target language only. And where we're at now, in a world where multilingualism is being valued, greatly, I think we've got to really respect that in the classes that we teach as well.
I'd love to hear your response to Eva's question. Eva says, the issue about mixed ability students and the issue about a classroom full of students whose foreign language level is very different. What would you suggest? I'd add to Eva's question and say, what about a classroom where everyone's L1 is different? Does that change the approach at all?
I work with multilingual groups and monolingual groups. So in the multilingual group, there's a lot of English. Obviously, there's a lot more English. They can't rely so much on their L1 through me. They might be able to with each other. In the monolingual classes, I think you've got to give them a little bit of leeway to use their language to solve problems, especially the low-level Arabic groups I work with, who kind of have to sort of negotiate. What's the word? Okay, Danny, can you? And I've learned that they sort of want to plan what they want to ask me a little bit. So I think the difference between the two simply is your knowledge of their language in the monolingual group will be very handy, but there'll be a lot more gaps as a teacher if you're working in a multilingual group.
The question was about mixed abilities. I wonder if students have mixed emergent language needs. In other words, are there some students who have got loads of questions and others who just want you to get through the page?
Yeah, I mean, start with the mixed ability. I mean, that's an issue for beyond emergent language for any classroom. And I've taught very mixed ability groups. Certainly when I taught ESOL, which is for asylum seekers, refugees, migrant workers, here in the UK, in Birmingham actually, you often come across this, and it's difficult to differentiate what you're doing, but actually emergent language does differentiate. And in fact, in ESOL, it's a type of differentiation that you're doing. It's this kind of spontaneous differentiation, or in sociocultural theory, they call it dynamic assessment, working out what each learner needs and working at with that edge of where they're at. So I think it actually caters for individual student needs. Let's say you've got learners working on a task, they're writing a dialogue, and you've got them in pairs. You might have a mixed ability there. Learners might be helping each other, but it certainly allows you to go over and provide support and push maybe the learner who's more able, and then give a bit of extra support for the learner who's not. So I think actually emergent language does provide a way of that kind of spontaneous differentiation that is needed in a mixed ability class.
And I think you do have students, when you were talking about emergent language need, and I know this was one of the questions we'd planned to talk about. There are some students, it's kind of all about the emergent language needs, because it's kind of, I want to say this now. And
that could be frustrating.
It can be frustrating for the teacher who's worried, especially the newer teachers we work with, who are thinking, oh my God, there's another 2 minutes outside of my plan gone. But that's how they're learning. That sort of need to do what they want to do at that moment is very important to them. They're kind of intolerant of being told to wait almost. So they might be the student I put into a group of 3, and then when I'm monitoring, they get that moment to ask me, will the other 2 work together?
We are live from Oxford. We're in Oxford University Press. We're talking about emergent language with Richard Chinn and Danny Norrington-Davies. We're coming to the end of our conversation. We have just under 10 minutes to go, but there's still time for you to share any questions or comments that you have. If there's anything you'd like to ask Richard and Danny about how we can work with emergent language as English teachers, use the Q&A tab to let us hear what your question is. There are some lovely questions coming in. There was a question that I can't see right now, but I read it a moment ago, which was just clarifying whether or not emergent language is something which can be used on pronunciation or phonology points.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, any of the language systems, you know, the kind of what we might look at as the easiest bits to hear, probably the easiest bit to notice is something to do with phonology. And it's a bit like the low-hanging fruit. It's not, you know, right, okay, I notice there's a consistent error here, let's go for errors, okay. Or maybe there's a gap in what the learners need help saying, or the learner asks you how to say something, I can't pronounce it, help me with it. So definitely working with phonology is important.
Emergent language working with emergent language includes recasting, where the learner says something and the teacher just repeats it back to them, modifying it in some way. And I notice, again, with newer teachers who tell me they're not hearing what learners are saying, or they don't feel comfortable working with emergent language. And the student said, I wish I had done that. And the teacher said, oh, you wish you'd done that? Lovely. Well, you know, they've just dealt with it. I mean, there's probably not a great deal of uptake in that moment. There could be, just because we don't see it. So those little pronunciation recasts can be really good. But that other thing about, okay, nice, but listen to me, now say that again. I think those little moments are very good. We see a lot of pronunciation.
Absolutely, and
work with emergent language.
Yeah, and if emergent languages come up, it could be a piece of grammar that you're looking at, or it could be an item. You're going to deal with the phonology as well, because that's a new piece of language that's come up, and you need to think about the meaning, the use, you know, its form, and how do you hear, you know, what's it sound like? How do you hear it? Because we want the learners to be able to decode it when they hear it in the future as well. We want them to be able to hopefully approximate it so that they can be intelligible.
I've noticed a question on the topic of assessment and how emergent language fits in with assessment. I think it's Adriana near the top of the list who's asked a question about that. Is there a way emergent language shows up during assessment? If so, how could a teacher deal with it? Or anything else you want to say about the topic of aligning emergent language with our assessment?
The first thing is, it depends on what kind of assessment you mean. Is it assessment of learning or assessment for learning?
Do you want to tell us what you mean?
So, you know, assessment of learning would be summative, something that we're testing at the end of a course, or, you know, maybe formative halfway through. But the assessment for learning is emergent language. When I'm listening to learners, I'm using it as a diagnostic, really, to see what they need help with. Where can I be useful to the learners? What do they need? So I think that's the first distinction I would make, is that, you know, we're assessing learners all the time when we're listening to them. So and that's where emergent language comes in response to that. And our assessment is very important. Our dynamic assessment is important with that.
And I think if you kind of have this lesson where you're noticing students struggling with a particular language point, let's say a grammar point, so you end up dealing with that because maybe you can, then task repetition is really, really good. So that going back to the lesson we had at the beginning where the students were saying it could be a football match, I think it's a football match, it might be a football match, is then doing another similar task later on and seeing, you know, what's different. A recent IATEFL talk I did was about task repetition and emergent language with lower levels. And what was quite interesting is that students often remembered a lot of the periphery language. They were repeating phrases that they'd learnt before because they'd used them before. And kind of not, the target language was being missed. So they were saying I think a lot, and their lexical range was bigger, but they were kind of, the target language was actually being a little bit more forgotten.
Interesting. Thanks so much to everyone for all the questions which are coming in. I'm keen to get through as many of them as we can in the few minutes which remain. Here's an interesting one from Judith, who says, how do you relate to provocative or bad language in class?
Interesting how we might interpret that. I think one of the interesting things about emergent language, and Danny and I were talking about this the other week, and it's something I've really been thinking about, is that actually, you know, the language in the course books that we encounter is often quite stilted, and it's kind of sanitized, and it's cleaned up, and it's parsnips. You know, it can't have politics. It can't offend anybody. So we get this very polite kind of language that the learners are being exposed to, and that's what they have to learn. And I wonder, you know, actually, you know, we were talking about this, that emergent language steps in to the space where learners need more language that might be more emotional. It might be language that's going to help them communicate their ideas more effectively, as opposed to the tidied up, you know, clean, appropriate language that we find in course books. So I think that's one thing to consider. I mean, you know, every context is going to be different. I wouldn't go in and ever teach a language on swearing, but, you know, certainly when things come up in class, I think, you know, we look at it, you know, because, you know, and treating it, you know, I teach adults, so, you know, a group of adults, then we look at that language and we, you know, sensitively explore it.
I work with teens and younger adults who kind of will test me with the odd word. So again, this idea that I do like to ask for opinions a lot. It's a big part of my teaching sort of persona. And then you'll get a teen, they'll say, oh, it's rubbish. They'll use a word instead of rubbish. I think it's really important to kind of respond to why they don't like the thing they've just said. So again, that thing about me listening and being interested in what they're saying. But then I might say, that word probably, if you were complaining about this restaurant, you couldn't really use that word. You'd be better off saying this. So I think I'd show them the learning opportunity that comes from that word.
And exploring the pragmatics of it. You know, when can you use this? Or when is it not a good idea to in different situations? I think that's the key thing. Turning it that way, you know, I think is a good idea.
We're actually coming to the end of an hour-long discussion.
Wow.
It feels like we just began. It feels like we've just scratched the surface. So much to say and so much left to say. But I'd love to invite you both to say anything that you'd really like to say that you haven't had the chance to say yet about this topic, or any observations about this conversation that have struck you as interesting.
One thing actually is that, you know, don't feel daunted by this. There are ways that you can work on this as a teacher, and we've got suggestions in our book on this. But, you know, things like practicing listening to the learners, practicing noting things down, maybe transcribing a little bit of your lesson and seeing what kind of questions are you asking. Are you asking the kind of open questions that are going to get conversation going, or are you only closing down the conversation with the questions that you ask? How do you engage the students in the lesson? Asking those questions about yourself and raising awareness of that is really important, and it's the first step to working with emergent language.
So I'll sort of build on that. The second you do that, the second you start asking yourself questions and monitoring your teaching, you are going to find out that you already are working with emergent language. It's just going to be these little moments here or there where you react to what the students are saying, and you help them say it in another way. And we can all do it, because we do all do it all the time.
And as soon as you become aware of it, it opens up further opportunities and choices that you have in your teaching.
Yeah.
That feels like a lovely moment to pause this conversation. It feels like there's a lot more to be said on this topic of emergent language. This conversation has been really enriched by the contributions that have come from the audience. So thank you on behalf of Danny and Richard to all of you for attending to the conversation and adding your thoughts and questions. Time has flown past, and our time is up. So with many thanks to all of you, I'm going to pass you back to Sean.
Thank you so much, Ed, and give our thanks to Danny and Richard.